Hey guys, enter the stars, and thanks for showing up last night to D13 Watchman's show. Very good discussion. I want to make some points and clarify some things talked about last night. I had a very long day. Was up at 6 a.m., got in about 8, and jumped on the show after a full day of fishing in the sun, so I was a little out of it. But I want to clarify some things, and I was a little caught off guard for such a deep discussion because I really wasn't prepared to talk in depth about those things, and of course I was tired and fatigued, but I want to just be a little bit more clear on my standpoint about the serpent seed doctrine. Okay, I also want to draw a line between me and any other associations with other people. I'm an individual, I have my own thought pattern, and because some of the work that Jonathan Kleck does I agree with, doesn't mean I necessarily agree with all of his things that he believes. And I feel like maybe the perception last night was that I was defending him and that I'm part of this serpent seed doctrine misinformation campaign. And that is not the case. Now I want to be very clear here, because in Genesis 4:1, which was the scripture that was brought up last night, they render the eth Yahweh, as you can see here, as from the Lord. But it literally means with Yahweh. So I have gotten a man, she's speaking about Cain, this is Eve, and they render it from the Lord, but it doesn't mean that. They changed it. It means with Yahweh. So obviously that's unintelligible. That's not the case, because she did not have Cain with Yahweh. And so it's probable that eth should be oth, which means the mark of Yahweh. And we know who had the mark of Yahweh. It was Cain. Cain had the mark of Yahweh. Now, they actually translated it incorrectly, saying from the Lord instead of with Yahweh, because they knew if they would have translated it with Yahweh, she had gotten a man, that it would not make any sense. And people would question that. Wow, God was Cain's father? No, it was the mark of Yahweh. So in looking at the context of how the word eth, which is what they're saying here, is translated, we have to look at the Bible author of Genesis and how the word eth is translated in the entire rest of the book of Genesis, because it appears many times. And as we can see here, the only time that it is translated as the word from the Lord, is in Genesis 4:1. The rest of the times it is translated as the words by, for, and with, which again makes no sense. I bore a child, I bore Cain with the Lord, makes no sense, which suggests that that fragment could have been corrupted and should actually say oth instead of eth, which means with the mark of the Lord. This is what the Bible talks about with the scribes and Pharisees. And Jesus warns them not to change the text a jot and a tittle. And this is what has occurred here. This is why there is biblical precedent in many, many places to look to confirm a belief. And therefore, we should never take one scripture and throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are many, 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 many more scriptures that point to a serpent seed bloodline. In fact, just in Genesis, just after this happens, God says there will be enmity between the two seeds. What seeds was he talking about, and why would he make that statement right after the sin had occurred? Because the seed line had split at that point. So now that we understand that this makes no sense, and that if translated correctly, this would say that Eve had a son with Yahweh, or had Cain with Yahweh, from Yahweh or with Yahweh, we now have to look to other sources. We don't want to make the leap and assume that it should be oth instead of eth. In other words, the mark of Yahweh, even though that is a reasonable explanation for the corruption in the text. But we don't want to make that leap because we would be just as bad as the scribes and Pharisees adding jots and tittles to change the meaning of the word. But what we can do is look at the rest of the Bible, and the evidence is overwhelming that in fact there were two rivaling bloodlines and seed lines, and that Jesus' blood had to be spilt to correct our blood. Plain and simple. And that the serpent had to go on his belly, and that Eve had a sexual type of consequence for what happened, which was birth pangs and birth. Do you see how the belly and the womb and birth pangs all fits in with a sexual sin? Now, unfairly, this doctrine has been associated with New Agers, and I believe that was done on purpose, so that people would not find the truth, and they would automatically associate this with New Age thinking. That is not the case, you guys, and the enemy will attach these negative connotations to the truth to try to discredit the truth. But there are many, many other instances, like in Daniel, where he says they will mingle themselves with the seed of men. Well, that connotates two separate seed lines. And when Jesus told the Pharisees, you are of your father, the devil, in a literal sense, he was speaking, I believe, in that instance. And of course, the Israelites battling the Nephilim giants post-flood, all throughout history, defending the bloodline of Jesus, the pure bloodline. So we had two bloodlines feuding with one another. I'll put a link of this in the description